and welcome to Yachting Monthly's how-to series, brought to you in association with GJW Direct. I'm Matthew Sheehan, and over the course of 13 episodes we're going to be dealing with some of the key issues when it comes to maintenance and talking to some of the experts to get their tips.
Hi, I'm Rachel Sprott, one of the founders of Rubicon 3 Adventure Sailing, and today we're going to be looking at winches. Winches are actually really simple and they're very easy to problem solve. They're really easy to maintain yourself, and there's absolutely no black magic involved. As long as you're careful, as long as you lay everything out properly at the beginning, you'll have absolutely no problem tackling your winches yourself. One of the most common problems is that the springs and pawls fail, and you'll know they failed because your winch will turn both ways. Instead of locking, it'll backwind, which is obviously really dangerous. So when we're stripping the winch down, we're checking the condition of the pawls, checking for any stress fractures or signs of rust in them, checking for wear. It'll be quite obvious if they're worn. And we're also checking that the springs are in good condition, that they're still springy, they haven't got rusty or corroded. And periodically you want to change these out anyway, every year or two. Just swap them all out, they're not expensive, put a new set in. It's not worth having the winch backwind for the sake of these little parts. So this is a 2-speed winch, meaning it's got 2 gears, a fast speed and a slow speed. And you can hear that it sounds fairly healthy. That little ticking sound inside tells us that the internal mechanisms are all working pretty well. But we're going to strip it down and have a look and see what we find inside, show you what's inside, how it works, and then talk about servicing them and troubleshooting. So most winches can be taken apart with 2 tools: a flat-bladed screwdriver and a set of Allen keys. You shouldn't need much more than this. Some of the older winches perhaps you might, but that will get you most of the way to the bottom of your winch. Before we start operating on the winch, we're going to lay out some cardboard and some cleaning rags. This could get messy and we need to make sure that we protect the decks. Really important to make sure that you've got a small container to put all the little bits in. And don't take one apart at sea unless you absolutely have to, because it's guaranteed that something's going to plop over the side. So we've got the decks protected, we've got our blue roll ready. The final thing we need before we start taking a winch apart is the manual. And this will have an exploded diagram inside, so that if at any point we get lost, we can come back to the manual and refer to where stuff's supposed to go. It's also useful to have a smartphone with you and take some photos as you take it apart, so you've got something to refer to. So the first thing with pretty much any winch is to take out the flat-headed machine screw in the top of the winch here. It's just a long stainless bolt. On some winches you could take the whole drum off now. On this winch we're just going to pull out the centerpiece. And that's revealed another set of machine screws in the top of the self-tailing unit here. So we'll undo these 3 next. So now we're going to carefully lift off the drum, making sure we don't lose anything from underneath it. So I've just put my hand under there. I'm going to put it straight down on a bit of cardboard. It's a bit greasy, so you don't want to put it directly on your teak decks. Now we've got the centre stem assembly here and some bearings. So I'm going to take those off and lay them out in order. and a big plastic washer. So I know when I put this back together that I'm going washer, bearing, bearing, and then this bit of the plastic assembly. Right, you can see we've got 2 gears here. In order to access them, we've got to take a bit more apart. So we're going to undo these Allen head bolts in the base of the winch there. I think it's a 5mm Allen key. Yeah. Whilst we're taking it apart, we can be checking out whether there's any corrosion inside. If the winch has been poorly installed, then they can suffer drainage problems, and you find the salt water sits inside with the dissimilar metals and fizzes away, causing galvanic corrosion. Okay, that's the last one out. The next task is to really carefully remove this centre stem without losing any of the bits underneath it. And that's revealing to us our 2 different gears and the ratchet system. So before we take anything else apart, you can see there's some drainage holes in the bottom of the winch, and the water's been draining out really nicely. The bolts that were holding the base down have all had some anti-corrosion gel put on them. Looks like some kind of anti-corrosion grease. That's because this is an aluminium base and a stainless steel bolt. So it'll stop the stainless interacting with the aluminium, fizzing it away. That's one to watch on the older winches. So the next thing we're going to do is just take this gear assembly apart very carefully. Now's a good time to take photos before you've taken everything off. And you'll see that, is this moving part? That's one big gear from the centre there. I'm going to try and keep those 2 together so that I know how they went, and I'm putting them the same way up. Another gear here with a bush inside it, plastic bush. Again, I'm going to keep that the same way up. And finally, our ratchet gear. So this is where the magic happens. These 2 little pieces of metal are called pawls. They're sprung loaded with a tiny, tiny little spring, and that action allows this cog to turn one way and lock when it goes back the other way. So the only thing stopping your winches from going both ways are these 2 tiny pawls and the springs in them. They're doing all the work. So this is the most common thing that could go wrong. If one of these pawls fails, or if the spring inside it breaks, then the winch will be able to turn both ways. It will back wind, which is really, really dangerous. So we're going to take this whole thing apart. We're going to clean everything down, and then we're going to check the internal parts for wear. Maybe replace some of these springs and pawls if they need it, and then reassemble it, giving it a light grease as we go. So the right way up. So inside here you can see the spring mechanism that pushes the pawls out. The springs are the most common thing to fail, and if a spring fails, then the pawls get stuck inside like this, and the winch turns both ways. So we're going to use a small flat-bladed screwdriver to take these pawls and the springs out and just check the condition that they're in. There we go. Okay, so I'm just holding the spring there and I'm trying to slide the whole pawl up and out of the housing. I have to be really careful at this stage that the spring doesn't spring out and disappear. I'm going to put my finger on it, point it down into the cockpit. There we go. Okay, so that's our pawl there with a tiny little spring. So these can get distorted, over time they might be less springy, they can corrode. So this one actually looks really, really good. That could go straight back in. You'll notice there's a particular way round for it to go. This one's got a bend here. So the flat side of the spring is going into the back of the pawl, and the bendy bit is what's going to recess into that housing there. Okay, so that's our second pawl. Right, once the winch is fully disassembled and we've had a good look over, we've checked for corrosion, we've checked for any broken springs and pawls, we're going to give it all a clean with a diesely rag and a toothbrush. You can use an electric toothbrush if you're really lazy, and take off all the old grease. So I've got a tub of diesel here. You can use mineral spirits or something else like that, something that's going to dissolve the grease from the winch. The grease is kind of there to lubricate, but also it collects the dirt in it. So you do need to strip the grease off occasionally and take all the old contaminated salts and bits of grit out of the winch. So we can literally put our cogs in the diesel, give them a clean with a toothbrush. I'm going to put some gloves on first. So I'm getting all the grease out of the teeth. Anywhere that the dirt can get stuck. I'm just going to let them dry in the sun a bit. As we're cleaning it, we're going to check the teeth on the gears for wear. So with time, you may find that you start to get some burrs on the edges of the teeth or worn faces on the teeth. And that's a sign that you need to start replacing some of the inner gears. This is a brand new winch, so it's looking absolutely perfect. I've got an old one here. So this came off one of our halyard winches from one of our boats. You can see it's heavily worn with the wear on the teeth there, the burrs on the edges, and that would just allow it all to start moving. And the more it moves, the more it wears, and everything else starts wearing down too. So eventually the winch will start to sound funny, it won't run smoothly, and you'll need to replace this cog and probably quite a lot of the other ones inside as well. But you've got quite a few years of use before they get to that stage. Okay, so we've stripped the winch, we've cleaned it all off, we've inspected it for wear, and we haven't found any broken parts, which is great. And we're going to put it back together again really methodically now, greasing it and oiling it as we go. So the first thing we're going to do is put the springs and the pawls back into this. So I've got my bent leg on the spring facing outwards. I'm going to pinch it together in my fingers and slide it down back in. You can see there's a little recess to hold the spring into position so that the spring can't bounce out. Do the other side. So we're going to just put some light lube on the springs and the pawls here. They need to be able to move in really cleanly So we don't grease these tiny bits, we're going to grease everything else apart from the springs and pawls. Lost the spout on this. So we'll just let that work in there. That'll just protect it a little bit, help it move nicely. Then we're going to find its housing. So this is the housing. Can go either way up in this particular instance, and we're just going to pinch those two pawls together and slot it back in there, like so. You'll see that this gear came off this particular post. Just going to make sure that this post is got a bit of grease on it as well, because this is stainless into aluminium. So if we need to, we can put a little bit of copper grease, which is an anti-corrosion grease. Just put a tiny little bit on to stop it corroding in there. Make sure that's firmly down. One thing not to forget is the washers. It's so easy to forget to put a washer on, and the washers not only help things move, but they also make sure that everything's aligned at the right height. So if you forget a washer, you'll often find that the teeth on the different gears won't quite sit right. So do make sure those go back on in the right place. So here we can see that we've got the washer, the gear for the springs and the pawls, and this tells us that this piece sits that way up. Cool. Next up, we can put our other gear back in. That's this one. So as we reassemble all the gears, we're going to put some grease on them. You can buy the Winch specific grease, so Harken make their own grease, Lumar make their own grease, but generally a standard marine grease will be absolutely fine for this. So, a little bit of that. Doesn't need masses, it's just enough to give it a thin film. Protects it from the salt and the salty weather. And then we're going to pop that one down on there. The reason we don't grease the springs and the pawls on the inside is that the grease traps the dirt, so it makes them more likely to seize up and fail. Right. Okay. Here's one I greased earlier. And then, so we're going to slowly reassemble the winch, making sure that we haven't forgotten any key parts.
Okay.
So we've got all our bolts back in the base here, and I'm just going to go round and give them a final tighten. If you really wanted, you could do this with a torque wrench, but as long as you get them snug, you'll be absolutely fine. Okay. Now we're ready to put the bearings back on for the drum. So we had a big nylon washer. Probably don't need to grease this bit, it's just plastic on the aluminium. Then 2 bearings, they can have a little bit of grease. Don't need much. If you've got metal bearings or stainless steel bearings, you might want to give them a bit more of a grease, and they will need a really good clean to get the old grease off. Then we are ready to put the drum on. No, we're not. Then we're going to put this back on, which I can't remember what it's called. Okay, so that's all back together. Now we're ready to put the drum on. Self-tailer. The drum's got these teeth underneath, so we've cleaned those off and just given them a light grease before reassembling it. That should all slot down nicely. The bits I've got in my hand now are the self-tailing unit. So we've got this thing called the stripper arm, the peeler and the stripper. They need to slot back together, and ideally you want the arm of the self-tailer at about 7 o'clock to where you would use the winch. So if we would use the winch from the cockpit there, we'd have the stripper arm about there. It just makes it a bit easier to use. Actually, we've got our long bolts to hold the self-tailer unit down. Again, these can have a little dab of anti-corrosion compound. Not sure then. I'm just going to nip these up. They don't need to be crazy tight, but good nip. Before I put the final part on top, I'm just going to check that it sounds good. That sounds nice. It feels nice and smooth. I can feel those pawls moving really cleanly, and it locks, very importantly, when we try and turn it the other way. So that's good. We can put it back together. I'm going to hold that and tighten that up. And that's all secure. Still spinning freely. And the final thing to do is just to take any grease off from the outside, especially if you've got the drum greasy. We want the friction of the drum to hold our sheets and our halyards, so make sure that's fully cleaned up, and we're good to go.
Well, thanks for watching. I hope that was of help. Make sure that you like us, make sure that you subscribe to us, and stay in touch for the next episode.